Hi, I'm Leigh Haber. I'm books editor for O, the Oprah magazine, and the editorial director of Oprah's Book Club. And I am pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Books Festival, in which I am moderating a conversation, I'm pleased to say, with Salman Rushdie and Maaza Mengiste. Their books are available for purchase below. Thanks for coming. So welcome, hello, really nice to meet you. You know, it's been a pleasure reading your work, both of your work for years. And I'm so happy to be here talking to you and trying to figure out the interconnections and intersections between the two of you as wonderful writers. So I guess I'll just launch into it. Salman, why do you think that the Brooklyn Books Festival had the ingenious idea of pairing you with Maaza?
Well, because I suggested it.
Okay. And why did you suggest it?
Well, because, you know, we've done a couple of these things and they're always very enjoyable. And I'm an enormous admirer of her work and of this book in particular, The Shadow King. I think I was one of the first people to read it, wasn't I? I mean, other than your...
You were. You were.
I mean, I loved it immediately. And so it's nice to be able to say that, you know, and to talk about it. We're both, you know, we're both immigrant writers in America. So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, what struck you first about The Shadow King? You know, the period is so interesting, Maaza. I wonder why you set it in that period of Ethiopia's history.
Well, it's that Mussolini's invasion in 1935 and Ethiopia's subsequent victory over these invaders is a story that I heard growing up again and again and again. So it, you know, when I was thinking about stories that inspired me, this was something that I looked at automatically. But I have to answer, you know, a little like Salman, the question that you asked Salman, in terms of, this is, I don't think anyone else would be aware of this. But years ago when I was in the process, when I was still writing this book, and I was still trying to figure out structure and pacing and all of those things. I think Salman, you and I had a conversation, or maybe I had a conversation with Marlon, who was telling me about a conversation he had with you. This is how it goes down the line. Marlon James, yeah. And he had mentioned, I think Marlon said, oh, well, Salman told me to read this book called War Music, which is by Christopher Logue. And I said, oh, I'm going to read that because I like, you know, I like what Salman is doing with his work. So I read that, and it influenced the way I wrote The Shadow King. So it's a nod to Salman that this book was structured the way that it was, and also to Marlon. Thank goodness for mentioning that book, because it shifted what I thought I could possibly do with this story.
And Salman, did you know that you had that effect?
Well, I found out. Yeah, I mean,
I told him.
I mean, what I love about about War Music is that it's a sequence of books actually that were eventually collected in one volume, in which the British poet Christopher Logue essentially responded to Homer's Iliad and made modern versions of. So each book that he published was two books of the Iliad, you know, and he never finished the project before he passed away. But they are just some of the most brilliant rereadings of the classics that I've ever seen, and amazing about war. You know, I mean, amazing writing about war. So yeah, I'm glad it helped. It's helping me right now, actually, because I shouldn't say this, wrestling with something.
Please do.
Wrestling with something classical myself right now, and
that's exciting.
And yeah, I've been reading War Music, so there's another connection.
So Maaza, what was the shift that was prompted by reading Salman's suggestion?
Um, it's a way to break up structure. It's a way to really claim a historical moment and make it your own in a way that so that it feels modern. And I think what was really intriguing about Christopher Logue's approach with the Iliad and this great Trojan War is he revisioned it, brought it forward so that in certain moments he's talking about the Vietnam War, or he'll have planes in some of these scenes, and I just thought that was magnificent. The way he just said, I can use a framework, but I'm going to make this thing mine.
Mhm.
And that was really inspiring.
It reminded me also about your book and the way in which it plays with history and, does things which are obviously historical and other things which are obviously not. And then there's a whole range of things which I'm not sure about if they're historical or not. But it's not, there's other antecedents. I remember, Derek Jarman, the British filmmaker, made a film about the life of Caravaggio in which he had like trucks and garages and to depict the kind of life Caravaggio had led in the Renaissance. He used kind of modern equivalents, and that was very inspiring, I think, to me. I've always been a kind of history writer in a way. I mean, a lot of my writing has had an origin in some historical moment or other, whether recent or ancient, and I also have always liked to fool around with it,
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, and yeah,
How much actual historical research did you do for the novel?
a lot. I did a lot. That doesn't mean it all went in there. It's the one thing you realize is you do all this work and not all of it goes in. But I have to say that I'm really sorry. I'm in a really loud neighborhood. But
Gives us a little flavor for Queens. That's
okay, good. But reading Salman's work and Quichotte. I had an opportunity to talk to him about that book when it was first published, and one of the things that I noted, which is also this thing that I was aspiring to in my own work, is the way that that you're in the presence of a writer who knows their history, but can circumvent it.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have that knowledge first in order to go around and upend it.
Right.
And I see that again and again in Salman's work, and this is something that I really wanted to do with this, but you have to know this first before you can turn it around.
I think about that all the time, whether it's when you're reviewing a book or interviewing a person, if you have immersed yourself in their work or, in knowledge of them, it's easier to, find windows in instead of just adhering to a script. Yeah. But of course, on a much deeper level, Salman, with this book in particular, I mean, you can feel the knowledge, and your conversance with, contemporary politics, with history, with American history, with Indian history, with pop culture. So talk a little bit about how all of those threads, because there's so many different threads in the book, so many different plot lines and even genres within the book. How did your mind work? I mean, did you plot anything out, or did it come pouring out? What was your process?
What's happened in my writing over the years is that process has kind of changed. That when I was younger, I needed an enormous amount of architecture before I could start. And I needed to have a very worked out structure and a kind of skeleton before I could start putting flesh on it. And as I've gone on, that's become less and less important to me. And I've now reached a point where I think, obviously, I kind of know what the book's about, and I know that it's sort of going to go from here to there, roughly speaking, and along the way it's going to visit these particular moments, but I really like to make it up as I go along, you know. And I mean, I find now it's in a way the difference between writing a piece of music and playing jazz, you know.
Mm.
I mean, jazz has a kind of, a jazz piece has a sort of structure, but within that structure, there's an enormous amount of freedom, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You can discover things, you know, you can discover the music as you're playing it. And to me, that's become more and more interesting and kind of enjoyable. So a lot of this book, really the journey revealed itself as they were taking the journey, you know, and there were things about their journey across America and then back again the other way across America that I had never expected that would be in there. You know, for example, this chapter when they arrive in a town in New Jersey, which is full of people turning into mastodons.
I know. That was out of the blue.
Well, it really was out of the blue. And where it came from was just a sudden memory of something that had happened more than 50 years ago when I was still at university. And I took part in a production of Eugène Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, in which there are people in this small town in France turning into rhinoceroses mysteriously, you know. And I remembered I was 19 or something, and I remembered being in this play and being puzzled by the play and saying to the director, you know, what's this about? And he said to me rather kindly, he said, you know, Salman, it's about fascism. And I said, oh, how is it about fascism? And he said, well, it's about what can happen in a community, whether it's a village or a country, where suddenly people who were your next door neighbors turn into monsters.
Yeah.
They seem alien to you. You can't talk to them. They speak a different language. They're transformed. They're rhinoceroses.
I suddenly got very sad when you said that.
And I thought, oh, now, you know, like more than 50 years later, this comes back to me. And I think, you know, maybe we're kind of there again.
Right.
You know? And maybe we're now living in an age where we are so alien from each other that we see each other as monsters. You know? And then I thought, well, I can't have rhinoceroses because he's got rhinoceroses.
Right.
So I'll have pink elephants.
Well, you know, that's fascinating. And I do, you know, I've been watching your commentary on the current state of our culture, our politics. But going back to the reading experience, I felt like, you know, you were talking about jazz. I feel as if reading this book, you have to be sort of like if you're in the ocean and there are waves coming at you, if you fight the waves, you get all twisted up. And if you just go with it, it's an exhilarating ride. So that was my feeling in reading the book.
I feel that with a lot of books, you know, that if you trust the storyteller, then you can just go with it.
Right.
If you don't trust the storyteller, then you're resisting it all the time, you know, and that becomes a difficult reading experience.
Right.
So,
right. Maaza, one of the things I enjoy so much about The Shadow King is that you're taking the epic, the Odyssey, you know, form and making it a woman's story too. Did you consciously, how did you approach that idea?
Well, initially I didn't really know the story of how involved women were in the war. I knew I wanted them to have some place in the book, but I had relegated them in an earlier draft to caretakers, to those women who followed, you know, took care of the sick, buried the dead, got water, cooked the food for the army, and all those things that they did do. It was just by chance that I started stumbling upon research. You know, in my research, I was starting to find evidence that, wait a minute, actually there were women who were fighting in the front lines. And one of the first places I found it was in a New York Times article of November 1935. There's a story about a woman who picks up the gun after her husband, who's leading the army, is killed. She picks up his gun and leads his army into battle, continues on. And I thought, if she's picking up his gun as soon as he fell, she's right there, right next to him, which means she must have been fighting. So what else am I missing here? And that just gave me a direction. And then once I found one, you know, as a novelist, there are bound to be 5. And then if there are 5, there might be 10 or 20. But, you know, I have since found out from a historian who has specifically studied this, that there were hundreds of women who joined and were fighting, and it was a substantial number in the army. And that was amazing to find out.
Yeah, and to kind of recapture the narrative. You know, because so often female stories have been narrated over time by men, but more and more, I think women are going back and retaking the narrative, you know, and rediscovering connections in the past that we were unaware of,
right?
Like this one. I love that story. And I love that you were receptive both to, you know, Salman's suggestion, but also to the New York Times piece. I don't know, it suggests a beautifully open mind and heart, you know, that you can shift and pivot and, you know, find new threads to follow. And one of the things that strikes me with both of you, you know, I think so often readers are kind of unaware of what a community of writers globally there is. And Salman, you were the president of PEN, you know, you've lived in a variety of places. I think you kind of embody that, that spirit. Can you talk about how, you know, there's one version of writers as being kind of rivals of one another, but the one I see more, you know, much more, which I think is much truer, is this community, this global community of writers?
I think, you know, things have changed. I mean, just yesterday, I was watching a documentary about the relationship between Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams. And they were kind of friends. They knew each other for a long time, but they were not very friendly,
right,
towards each other. And there are moments where, in particular, as you would expect, perhaps, Truman Capote was colossally rude about Tennessee Williams, you know, in print. And I've read other correspondences between writers of that generation who write to each other very intimately as friends, but in those letters absolutely trash each other's books. And I think that sort of isn't happening now. You know, I think there actually is more fellowship now, and less of a sense of a boxing match. You know, I don't feel that we're trying to beat each other anymore. You know?
And how do you explain that?
Maybe it's just got tougher. Maybe we just need each other more.
Well, I think also, if I'll speak for you as writers, you're traveling to festivals. You know, this one is virtual, but often, you know, you're going to conferences and festivals. You know, and I also think there's something to the fact that writing now, the published writers now, it's more inclusive group. You know, more women, more writers of color. You know, so more, you know, sort of connecting different types of people. I don't know. So that's just one theory.
You know, I think we like each other more than people think that used to be the case. You know, and I mean, I think it is true that if you don't admire somebody's work, it's kind of difficult to be their friend. You know?
Right. Right.
But if you do, it's sort of easy.
And Maaza, you've experienced this firsthand, right? The community, the fellowship among writers.
Yeah, you know, I was just thinking though, as you were asking this, I think there's a sense that, you know, we do have these writing festivals, we have social media, we're able to communicate. If we haven't ever met someone, we might have communicated with them in one way or another. I'm also thinking about, though, the way that we've seen there are some recent shifts in the publishing industry where, you know, because of the protests, the uprisings, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that the publishing industry has begun to recognize that we can we can be friendly with each other, but what's important is how are books and writers from, you know, marginalized communities actually getting heard and read and represented well. So I think there's that friendliness can sometimes be a camouflage for the actual work that still needs to be done within the publishing industry. But I have been heartened by some of the shifts that I've seen. And I think that some of the more difficult conversations that needs to happen, hopefully now we're beginning to talk about it. But part of it is because we've been in these, you know, in communication and these fellowships that you were talking about, that some of, you know, a lot of this has happened, and that I appreciate.
Yeah, I think Maaza is absolutely right that there's beginning to be, but there needs to be a structural change in the publishing industry, which ceases to be so male-centric and so white-centric, you know, which it historically has been, you know, and I certainly felt, coming to live in America 20 years ago, that one of the most remarkable things happening in American literature, even from then to now, was this explosion of writing by people who were from everywhere in the world. You know, writers, I mean, you know, American literature historically was influenced by Eastern European British migration and kind of Southern European Italian migration and a certain amount of Hispanic, you know, but now it's literally everywhere. You know, there's Maaza from, you know, from that bit of Africa, there's Chimamanda from another bit of Africa, there's you know, Junot Diaz from the Caribbean, there's various wonderful Vietnamese American writers, and suddenly what American literature is being reinvented by writers from who identify as American but who come from everywhere, you know. And when I was writing this book, Quichotte, I thought maybe, you know, maybe I could do that. You know, I mean, I come from somewhere else too. You know, I've got, you know, other stuff in my baggage, and maybe if I unpack that stuff, kind of in America, that might be interesting. So I think it's very interesting because writers are rarely influenced by writers who are younger than themselves. And I find that those writers who are a generation younger than me are much more inspiring to me right now than anyone else, because I think what they're doing is so interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of exuberance and bravery, you know. I was reading recently a novel called A Girl is a Body of Water, which I'm absolutely loving, which takes place in Uganda, and which does something similar to what you're doing, Maaza, you know, which is sort of reclaiming the, you know, the sort of epic journey that has been traditionally male.
Yeah, Jennifer Makumbi is a wonderful, wonderful writer, and her first book, Shintu, is spelled with a K, I-N-T-U, is absolutely magnificent. So it's I'm glad to hear these other voices that are coming in. And I think, like Salman was saying, you know, it's just not one writer that's representing an entire continent. We have all these other writers coming up, and that's exciting to see.
Yeah,
go ahead, Salman.
I remember being a little bit embarrassed, like when Midnight's Children came out, and the front page review in the New York Times Book Review said that it sounded like a continent finding its voice. And I thought, really?
Yikes.
Hundreds of millions of people with literatures in like 20 languages, which have been going on for centuries. And this is the continent finding its voice? That's embarrassing.
That is a bit embarrassing in retrospect.
Now, of course, the story of Indian literature in English has become so remarkable that nobody would say that anymore. You know.
Well, I'd like to shift a little bit. I would be remiss if I didn't bring Addis Ababa Noir into the conversation. I find the series so interesting. Maaza, tell us a little bit about why you decided to take on the editing of that project and what the criteria were for, you know, what is a noir story?
I'll do that, you know, and while I'm answering, I'm very curious. I think after this, I would love to hear from Salman about maybe India's definition of noir, because one of the first things that I had to do with this collection is think about how would Ethiopian writers understand noir? It's just not a genre that's popular, available in Ethiopia. The writing has always been liturgical. It has been, there's always a moral at the end of the story. People end up okay. It's either entertaining or academic or religious. And traditionally, even though there, you know, there are other writers doing this. So when I approached different writers, I told them, look, noir is, it doesn't end well for most people in that, you know, you can imagine that there's a murder mystery or something has gone wrong. This is a dystopic society, you know, so make of that what you will.
Perfect for now, by the way.
Yeah, right. But what was really fascinating was the stories that came back. There were a good number of them that really revolved around the 1974 revolution, very bloody revolution in Ethiopia. And then there were other stories that featured the disappeared and the spirits that would come back. Either disappeared because these are refugees who just suddenly vanished, because that is also a story of Ethiopia, all these refugees that go through the Mediterranean or whichever way, and just so we'd have these ghosts, these spirits, these disappeared people resurfacing, and then you have the revolution. And I think that was probably the most interesting aspect for me, is to discover this is how Ethiopians would translate noir, perhaps. But we have 13, 14 varied stories in that collection, and the writers are both very established and emerging, and it was wonderful to work with them on this.
I love how you express that, because, you know, I was writing something down, noir being cynicism, fatalism, and moral ambiguity, but also when you did an interview somewhere with a couple of your writers, and you talked about how noir is the darkness that creeps into everyday life. So you kind of combine that with the history of the country and, you know, the darkness that has never gone away. It's never been resolved, right? So I think that's a really interesting way of seeing it. And Salman, in the new book, you know, this isn't a direct connection, but you have a character who is a spy novelist, essentially, right? I mean, my
alternative.
I guess most spy novels are not noirs, but you've got the genre thing going on, right?
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I mean, you know, one of the things I kind of always wanted to write a spy novel.
I love spy novels.
And
The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is probably one of my favorites.
Yeah. And Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, while we're talking about
another great one.
You know, there was a moment in my life when, for reasons we don't have to go into, I met quite a lot of spies.
Yeah.
I got, you know, I got to know that world a little bit. You know, I've been in that James Bond building on the River Thames. You know, I've been in there several times, which
of course
not a lot of literary novelists get to do. You know, so
lucky you.
But yeah, so I thought, you know, I should write a spy novel, but it never really happened. This is as close as I'm going to get by having an unsuccessful spy novelist as a character. But some of the stuff that I found out back then got into this book because, for example, there's a thing that the spy novelist writes about, which is this organization of intelligence services called the Five Eyes.
Five Eyes.
The Five Eyes are basically the intelligence services of 5 English-speaking countries. You know, as I say, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, can't remember the 5th one. Anyway, 5 of them. And the interesting thing is I didn't make that up, that exists.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. that exists. It's the most important intelligence organization in the world. And the thing about it is that everybody distrusts everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, everybody distrusts the Americans because they can't keep secrets. Everybody distrusts the British because they're snobs. Everybody distrusts the Australians because they never come up with anything. But I thought it's kind of wonderful that I don't even have to make it up. It's right there. You know? And so I was able to, in a fairly noirish way, I was able to use that. I was going to just say about the noir that what seems to be happening in India, not so much in fiction, but in film, and not even so much in film, but in film made to be streamed on the internet, you know, kind of original internet material. There's an enormous amount of stuff which is dark in that noirish way, you know, about crookery and cynicism and all the things we were talking about. So seems to have found an expression there in original work directly streamed, which never goes into theater, not designed to go into theaters. And that's the way in which new technology can provide like a new formal opportunity. You know?
I just have to say before we move on from this topic that if you haven't seen The Bureau, the French spy series, you have to see it. It's fantastic. Maaza, I was just wondering if editing and writing a story for the Noir series, has that something that's going to permanently alter the way you write? I mean, has noir sort of is that going to creep into the next novel?
That's a good question. I don't know. You know,
because it is a way of,
you know, I have to say, when Johnny Temple, when I turned in this anthology and I said, all right, I'm done. It took a little while because I was writing my novel in the process, and then I was done. And I emailed Johnny and said, oh, I'm so glad it's finished. And he emailed back, he's like, you know, you have to write your own story. I was like, what? I don't write noir, Johnny. And he's like, well, you asked all these other writers to do it. So I had to figure that out. I think it would be fun, like Salman. I think the idea of writing a spy novel would be a blast. I think it would be really interesting. It was, I did this story. I don't, you know, it's my own definition of noir. Again, it fit into what everybody else seemed to be doing as well, which was not really paying attention to the genre. But it would be really interesting to do some kind of a noir detective spy thing. That would be a blast, and maybe a breath of fresh air after a really long involved writing process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the appeal of genre, you know, it's very seductive. I mean, in Quichotte, I kind of played with two genres because as well as the spy stuff, there's also science fiction. You know?
Yeah.
And science fiction was like my first addiction. You know, I mean, when I was like a teenager onwards and actually started reading a lot of books, I devoured the science fiction of the period, you know, of what is now considered to be the golden age. I mean, and I became very knowledgeable about it, you know, and then I kind of stopped reading it. And went on and read many other things, you know. And then again, in the same way that something comes back from half a century ago and tells you how to write a book you're writing now, a couple of science fiction stories that I literally hadn't thought about since I was maybe 21 or something, you know, came back and actually at rather critical moments of the book showed me what to do, you know. And I mean, what happens in my book is not at all like what happened in either of those stories, but they were the keys that opened the door, if you know what I mean. You know, so yeah. So as this book goes on, it goes through a number of genres, if you like. You know, it's a road novel, it's a spy novel, it's a picaresque novel, it's a surreal novel, it's an absurdist novel, and ends up being a science fiction novel. You know? Mm-hmm. And I just thought, the world is so strange right now that it's really hard to find a way of getting hold of it, you know, and So I thought, I'm just going to try everything. I'm going to try and use the entire repertoire of literature and come at this crazy place that we're in from like 16 different directions. And
in that way, you really have captured the zeitgeist. And I was going to, as the final question I was going to put to you, which you've sort of already answered, Salman. Maaza, I mean, how do you, as a fiction writer, launch your next project in this bizarre time where the reality truly is stranger than anything we could have imagined?
Well, you know, okay, let me add one more thing that Salman was saying about his book. In the midst of all of these different genres that he is he's wrapping into this story, I have to say that it is also a really heartwarming story about a father and a son, and that part of it was what that thread really stuck with me through the entire thing. So I have to say that it was really a pleasure to talk to him when it first came out. But that really struck me. It's a story about a family as well, coping
Love.
Yeah, but it's in a way not romantic love. You know, it's
right.
It's about love inside families.
Yes.
Which can go wrong and sometimes can go right, and sometimes can be healed if it goes wrong, and sometimes you know, but that's the, I mean, I'm glad you said it. Well, that to me is the emotional heart of the book, you know. And then there's all this playfulness all around it, you know?
And I think in terms of your question, Leigh, about how do we create in this, I mean, I have to say that, and I often say when I started writing The Shadow King, America was a basic democracy. And by the time it got published, we were firmly in an irrational and authoritarian time. The book, set in 1935 during the time of fascism, was already there, but what I was, my present day was starting to match the research and what I was writing about. And now when I'm thinking about, okay, what the next book, you know, what will the world be like? There are two things. Number one, we can never predict. Number two, as long as we center our stories on human beings and those complicated interactions between them, we're always going to be of the moment. And whatever else happens, that part is always going to be true because we're so complicated in how we behave with each other.
And human nature is the great constant.
Yes.
It's the thing that never changes. That's why we can read books from 200-300 years ago and we still can still connect with them. Books from countries we've never been to and we still understand because this is what we are, and we're like this whether we like it or not.
Yes.
Well, I think we'll have to end it there, and it couldn't be a better note on which to end this wonderful conversation. Thanks to you both, and thank you to the Brooklyn Books Festival celebrating its 15th anniversary. Okay, stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Salman. Thank you, Leigh. Bye.
Love you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maaza and Salman. And thank you to the Brooklyn Books Festival, who's celebrating its 15th anniversary. You're free to make a donation to the Brooklyn Books Festival, and a reminder that Salman's and Maaza's books are available for purchase at the link below. Thank you.